Hello, and welcome to a fresh episode of Platypod Perspectives, where each time around we feature an amazing image like this one. And it's something that always captures photographers' attention, just an incredible image. And then we talk to the artist behind the image. And this time around, his name is Don Komarechka. Don, so nice to see you. Thank you so much for joining us on Platypod Perspectives.
Larry, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for bringing me on to talk about an image that I think is one of those shots that many people think is not approachable, right? There's a lot of moving parts that are involved in an image like this, but once you break it apart, it's really simple to construct something like this, and especially so because this image was shot on my phone. You know, it wasn't shot on any of my fancy camera gear, of which I have an abundance of. I have more macro lenses than most people would consider healthy. But I had found at a certain point in the game that if I shoot with simpler equipment, then people will have a greater appreciation for learning the technique rather than getting caught up in the gear. So that's kind of the approach we're taking today.
Well, that's a great point, and that's exactly what we want to dive into is how did you pull all of this together? So I know you've got some behind the scenes images you can share, but would you start by unpacking the structure? So you've got a small studio, you've got a lot of things, but you've got a studio where you set this up. And let's start with the idea and then building out those beautifully spaced drops of water, turning them into lenses. How did all of this come together?
So water droplets, the more spherical they are, the more they will act like a lens, and they will refract an image of whatever you have placed in behind them. And this is not a new concept. I'm not the person to invent this concept, but it is a really fun one to explore, and I think everybody should try it at least once, because you can do this on your kitchen table. You don't need a big studio space. Remember, macro photography is done on a small scale, so I have a bunch of platypod equipment that is holding the various elements together. And that platypod gear, I think, is paramount to the success of some of these shots. There's other ways to do it too, but it just makes it really succinct and easy to not get caught up in the gear and focus on making these little lenses. Now, there's a number of ways to get these water droplets. I have used spray bottles. You can even get automatic battery-powered spray bottles. But to get them individually and uniquely perfectly spaced, the tool of choice is just a needle on a syringe. You can get blunt tip needles. They might even be more effective than the hypodermic stabby ones. So, I mean, play it safe, folks. You can buy blunt tip needles of all sorts of different gauges on Amazon or wherever you find those things. And the smaller the gauge, the better, which is the bigger the gauge number as a relationship. So think about something as narrow as an insulin needle, because the metal of the needle is hydrophobic. The water droplet wants to escape from that very quickly. And so you can easily just drop droplets of water. And this is, by the way, a lot of people ask me, is there any additives? What's your secret recipe for water? It's the water that comes out of the tap. Nothing added to it whatsoever. Some people will say add glycerin or white corn syrup, which is like a glucose syrup, and that'll change the properties of the water to make it stick more. But on the right surface, a water droplet will stick just fine. And that's not every surface. Wildflower seeds are a great example of one that works, but also certain flower petals. And I found that Gerbera daisies, which work great for the background image, their petals, in most cases, will also just keep the water droplets staying still. And if it doesn't, like if it wants to roll away, hold it in place for 10 to 20 seconds and then pull the needle away, and it will have had enough time to bind with the surface and stay where you've placed it. So that's the idea. The concept is flower petals revealing a flower in the background. But the position of the flower in the background is also key, because if you'll notice, the out of focus background in this image is that Gerbera daisy. The entire background is the out of focus flower. Where I place the center of that flower, and I've specifically chosen a flower with a dark center so that the center is a different color than the flower petals, and that creates a really nice kind of contrast zone. And I can put that dark center wherever I desire. At first, I might have experimented putting it more on the left side of the image where the two petals come together, but I found that it worked out best on the right side where kind of the trail of the petals ended. And it's an iterative process to get this to work. And when I'm sitting in my studio working on these types of concepts, yeah, I might take 50 different attempts at it. I might, maybe even 20 or 30 of those are ones that I attempt without even picking up the camera because I'm just not able to get the subject to work together properly. And a few hours go by and I don't even notice the time go because you're just having so much fun playing, building these little sculptures that are, if you get it right, then worthy of photographing.
One of the things that I've noticed about this is, first of all, I know the secret behind the image itself being from an iPhone. And there's beautiful shallow depth of field. And this is a gorgeous macro image. And I've seen lots of macro images you've created over the years, but this one coming from an iPhone, my jaw dropped. And then I read on the Platypod blog how you did that. So would you share that with our viewers?
Exactly. So, number one, this was shot with the iPhone 15 Pro Max. It could have been the iPhone 15 Pro or the 14 Pro for that matter. It's roughly the same main camera. And that main camera, if you're shooting in RAW mode, and you can do that with third-party applications, I use Halide as the app. You can shoot 48 megapixel raw images on that. And that's useful for macro photography because oftentimes I find myself getting a little bit further back and then cropping in order to maximize the depth of field that I'm able to achieve. I do that on my professional interchangeable lens cameras as well. So using the main camera, using that particular mode of capture was what I did. But the main camera is not the macro camera. The macro camera by default would be the wide angle one, but you're only limited to a 12 megapixel resolution. And it's good, but it's not great, which is where comes in this little gem. This is a Moment 75 millimeter macro lens. And the Moment lenses, it'll mount on either the main or the the main or the telephoto camera on my with a special case that Moment also makes. And that allows me to then have that main camera immediately turned into a macro camera by the virtue of the addition of this little extra optic.
And most of our viewers could find something like that where?
So Moment has their own shop. You got to get the case and you got to make sure that you get the little insert that is for, in this case, the T series. They've got a few different series of lenses and it's just a couple of dollars to make sure you got the right inset in there, plus the case, of course.
Now, you also covered in the article a little mention of the lighting that you went through, the process that you went through to light this just right. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about that?
Of course. So lighting for macro photography can be tricky because the lights are generally very close to the subject. And sometimes that can be hard to control. And it's usually adjusted once you get the composition roughly the way that you want it. And so I've done a number of takes of these shots. I take one, I'll call it a safety net shot, where all the pieces are there, but they just need to be adjusted. And the biggest adjustment at that point is going to be the lighting. For water droplet work, you want to have a little bit of light on the foreground. You don't want to have it in silhouette, but you want to have more light on the background, that flower in the background, than on the foreground, because then those droplets and the flowers contained within appear brighter than the surface that they're attached to. And so if that's the case, they're really going to shine. They're going to sparkle. They're going to stand out exactly the way that you want. If you get the lighting incorrect and you put too much light on the foreground is going to appear flat. It's going to compete for your attention, and it's just not going to do what you want it to do. But that is part of the iterative process, is carefully aligning those lights to be exactly where you want them. In this case, I was using Platypod goosenecks and elbows to just get the lights exactly where they needed to be, and you can be pretty precise with that equipment.
Don, this has been a great learning experience and a little bit deeper dive than what we even saw in the blog. And I really always appreciate understanding how you've created these incredible macro images. I've been following your work for a lot of years. And would you please let other people know how they can follow what you do, I know you've got a new coffee table book coming out soon. So tell people a little bit about how they can research Don Komarechka.
You can go to doncom.ca or .bg for that matter. Both work. As a Canadian now being transplanted into Bulgaria, all of the stuff that I'm doing is linked to there. You can get my existing book as a digital copy still, and the links are available there. The next one, I don't know what the publisher's schedule is going to be like, and I'm still working on it. So stay tuned for that one. But if you're following me, sign up for the newsletter and you'll get an announcement of when that is going to be available. So I want to say thank you as well, Larry, for having me on. It's always a pleasure to talk about the way these shots come together and to be as transparent as possible as to the mechanisms that were at play in its creation.
Don Komarechka, thank you for joining us on Platypod Perspectives. That was an incredible episode. I always like talking to Don and learning from Don, and you always learn every single time. Who knows what you'll learn next time?